Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Stephen Interviews You, where I, Stephen Vitt, sit down and have a good chat with a special guest. And for this episode, this special guest makes college football videos, and his name would be, introduce yourself.
Jon Johnston.
Hi, John. Thank you for joining me for this interview. And let's just get started. Let's start talking about both your YouTube channels, both Corn Nation and Hardcore College Football History. So for starters, what inspired you basically to start making YouTube videos?
How terrible Nebraska football has become. Honestly, in 2020 during the pandemic, Minnesota came down to Nebraska. They were missing like 30 players. I think they were missing five line starters from defensive and offensive line, and they beat Nebraska. And I was so disgusted by this. I was so angry. I realized I didn't want to yell at my wife and my son. And I thought I'm just going to go for a walk. And I walked about 2 miles out into the woods, and I sat down next to a tree. And I took my phone out and I filmed myself complaining about the game. And we had a YouTube channel where we were doing the interviews and stuff. And I guess for that one, I just uploaded it and it got like 6 or 7 thousand views. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just do this from now on. Because what I found was if I didn't do that, if I didn't get this out of me, this bitch session about "No, God, this game sucked and here's why it sucked and all that, that I stayed angry for 2, 3 days. But if I just sat down with a phone for 10 minutes and pretty much swore at it, uh, I could, I didn't feel bad anymore. I walked home and it was cold, obviously, but all the anger is dissipated by the time I got home. And so I kept doing that, and it exploded. And then the History Channel, I guess, I've always liked history for quite a while. And college football, I've always been a huge fan of college football. And when I go out on YouTube, there's something for everything, right? There's something for everybody. There's literally every niche. But when you go out on YouTube and you look at college football history, particularly, or football history in general, what it's been reduced to is these are the greatest games and these are the greatest players and these are the biggest hits and the biggest moments. Nobody has ever explained, for example, why do we have to come for a stop for a full second before the offense can begin? That's a rule. Why is it a rule? Well, because of Newt Rockne in 1920. Okay. How did the game start out from 1869, where it was basically mob football, and then become what we know today? It had to go through literally, 3 or 4 decades of a lot of blood and a lot of violence and an extremely deadly game before it got to the point that it could even be modern football that we kind of look at as modern football in 1912 basically. And then how did it evolve from there? And I think even when we look at people, we've reduced them to this is what they did in football. Where a lot of these people led unbelievably interesting lives. Like I think his Bronco Nagurski flew in a B-24 over the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. He flew like 25 missions and he had to jump out of his plane twice when it was landing. I think he never got injured, but that's a whole story of a human being's life that's pretty interesting. And I think that when you reduce it down to, oh, look, he carried the ball 16 times for 250 yards and that was his career, I think that's just, I don't want to say an insult, but I think we've taken the lives of extremely interesting people and reduced them to just tiny bits, where they have great stories to tell. There you go. That was long enough, wasn't it?
No, that's great. Uh, yeah, so continuing on with the history of college football, and particularly with hardcore college football history, your channel. Um, I really do enjoy how you break down all these stories about what happened in college football history. And so when you do research on historical pieces, like when it comes to either football formations or just stories in general, what is your process? How do you break it down?
Oh, wow.
before you make
How do
videos.
I,
Yeah.
yeah, well, how do I never thought about the process. There's a lot of time. Here's an example. How do I break it down? That's a damn good question. I never really think about it. I just start reading a lot of times. And then, I have a massive, huge list of stuff I want to cover. But let's talk about World War One. Okay. Like for most of people who would look at World War One and college football, they go, well, what does they two have to do with either one of them? Well, I know from reading some, because I read a lot, that basically Walter Camp was involved in World War One, and he came up with a physical regimen, and he was involved, I think, with the Navy. I haven't fully researched this, by the way, but he was involved with the Navy, and they started service football. Well, okay, why did they do that? That's the thing that gets me. Why did they do this? Well, they did it, and then I start looking into the why, because I'm a curious guy. Why would you bring football into World War One? Why would you have service teams? Why would just because it was fun? No, I think in the service you don't get to do things just because they're fun. There's usually a reason for everything, right? So I just start by, I guess, looking at the question why along with the subject and go from there. I haven't really thought about what process I have. What I've done for the stuff that I haven't even published yet, and I'm still researching or looking at, is you look at the events. It's important to know one thing. My channel's purpose is to be about history and college football, not just the sport. So you look at the great events over the course of the last, I don't know, 150 years in our country. What were they? Well, there's World War One, right? There's the Great Depression. How was football affected during the Great Depression? World War Two, the Korean War, Vietnam War. All through that cycle, you've gone from an extremely violent football game to coming up with different formations like the single wing, the double wing, the T formation, and then the uh, I formation, the wishbone, the RPOs, the spread, the blood,
Yeah.
and it goes on. It's just a massive thing. And I think it's just interesting in thinking, how did we get there from here, and who were the people involved along the way? And I guess when I look at people, when I go to look like Dick Butkus, I'll probably do Dick Butkus soon because there's a Dick Butkus award, right? Well, why did somebody name an award after Dick Butkus? And then I start looking into Dick Butkus' life, and there's usually a lot there. I guess it mostly just I'm rambling a lot about
It's
for
okay.
tools. For tools, I mean, the Internet Archive has tons of old books. Newspapers.com. I think the thing about newspapers.com is there's everything on there. And it was all published at one time, and this was information people read in their lives, right? We have this attitude. I think we have this attitude that newspapers back in the day, quote unquote, were never biased, and they were always telling the truth, and they were always about the news, and that's just so much. It's wrong. It's so completely wrong. They were so much more biased and so much more about clickbait headlines and sensationalism than we are today. But going through newspapers.com for like sports stuff, uh, you find a lot of what I want to say here. I mean, you realize that you're transporting yourself back to like 1924. And then you see all this stuff that's going on because like in 1924 you didn't have a sports page for all the other articles. Let's say Army beats Navy, and okay, the other articles of the day, that's a huge headline, but it's right next to all the other massive news stories, and then you get drawn into that stuff. And I part of my process sometimes is just going to look up a game, and like a game, Army Navy 1924, let's say, or Army Navy 1963. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy, I did a video about that. That obviously was an enormous effect on American history. And at the same time, they played a football game, But I usually somebody will leave a comment, for example, and they'll say, you should look at this game. And I'll go look at that game, but I won't just look at that game. I'll also look at all the events that are surrounding it. And then I get drawn into this rabbit hole of the past. And it goes on for a while. And it's, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have a process. It's ADHD process of grabbing. And I just try to, what I do is I think it's my background. I'm in my real life, I am an IT consultant. So I already have a way of collecting notes and information into stuff that I have to keep with me because most of the systems I work on are so complex that they have to be documented, or 2 weeks later, I forget what I did. That's a long, rambling answer to what is your process? My process is just grabbing stuff from the universe, I guess. I don't know.
Well, that's good enough for me. Yeah, so like I said, I mean, I really do appreciate what you do for college football history, your hardcore college football history channel. And in particular, just to get back to the Nebraska Cornhuskers and history. Um, in your opinion, as a Nebraska Cornhuskers fan, what would be your favorite period of time for Nebraska football?
Well, obviously, the easy answer to that is the 90s because we went on a 16-3 run over 5 years and Tom Osborne just beat the hell out of everybody. And those teams were fun to watch and they were just amazing teams that were so dominant on offense. Uh, they were dominant on offense and they had, exceptional defense. I mean, they were just dominant all around. It's like modern day, well, kind of Alabama under Nick Saban. So I think the other obvious answer is this. I spent from 1980 to 1987 at the University of Nebraska Lincoln. I was on the John Belushi plan, except unlike John Belushi, I finished college. So, I mean, it's hard to not look at that era and still, those are fond memories that I had at the University of Nebraska and the people, the friends I made along the way. So, if somebody said who was your favorite football player, it's probably always going to be Turner Gill because I think watching him run the offense was like watching a choreographed, beautiful. He was so beautiful and smooth when he ran. Um, I think the most intriguing, this isn't what you asked, but I think the most intriguing era of Nebraska football are the years that we were terrible. Nebraska, it, what happened during the World War II years is people don't know this. This is again more videos I need to make. Excuse me. What happened during the World War II years is if you were part of the Navy or Army training programs for officers, you could take all the players from everybody else basically because they were getting drafted. For example, Michigan had, I think it's the Navy V5 officer training program. And if you were in that program, you were required to play football because that was part of your physical regimen. Well, gee, la-di-da, I guess, in 1943, they took Minnesota's best players and not Wisconsin's best players, and they just beat the hell out of everybody. Well, Nebraska wasn't part of any ROTC. They weren't part of any program like that. One of their yearbooks says all we had was 4 Fs, and a 4 F is a person who's physically unfit to be in the service. So, from like Nebraska throughout its history has been really good at football, except for the World War II years up until the arrival of Bob Devaney in 1962. And then, you could say the last 20 years, we had some good years under Bo Pelini, but the last 10, 12 years have been really terrible. So those are nobody's favorite right now. Those are nobody's favorite Nebraska years right now.
Yeah. So continuing on with that, I would like to talk about the Frank Solich years of
Okay.
Nebraska, because I think that's a good segue into what goes back into what the Ohio Bobcats have been doing lately and in their history. But just the Frank Solich era in Nebraska. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
Whoa, that's a lot.
If you could put it in a
Uh,
nutshell.
you know what? I think that when the Frank was the obvious heir apparent to Tom Osborne, and I think that also just made him. It just screwed him. You know. Here's the thing. Right now, there's still people, particularly my age, that will say, well, they should have never fired Frank. Well, they were always going to have to fire Frank because of this. If you believe that Tom Osborne was a legendary coach, which I believe he's offensively, he was a mastermind. And the second area is he knew how to get players to respond. And he had a coaching staff that was, uh, his two guys next to him, Milt and, oh, come on, defensive coordinator. Milt Tenniper was the offensive line guy, and then the defensive coordinator. And oh my God, my brain is not working. But they had an exceptional coaching staff, and they had coaches that knew how to motivate the players. And then you give that job to Frank. First of all, I think he got screwed because Tom made him keep his existing coaches. And I think when you go, okay, you're in charge now, that person in charge should always be able to pick who they want around him. And that's not a knock on the old Nebraska coaches. It's just a matter of organizing and having a team, a group of coaches that work together cohesively. Frank should have been allowed to pick his own coaches. Uh, he was always going to be fired because he's not Tom Osborne. Tom Osborne is Nick Saban, Tom Osborne, probably. Because Osborne just, 25 years of never losing more than 3 games in a season and never winning less than 9. That's not normal by any means. And then you're the guy that replaces him. I mean, I don't know. That's like me walking on stage after to sing, after everybody's already sing Katy Perry or something. If you're Katy Perry, that's a horrible comparison because I just compared my terrible singing to Frank, and Frank was a better coach than that. Anyway, I do think it was terrible that he was fired after a 9-3 season. I think it was terrible that he just finally got to get his own coaches for 1 year, and then he was fired by a megalomaniac, Steve Peterson, who, probably still the most hated man in Nebraska.
Mm.
So I think that Frank was a good coach. The problem is he wasn't a great coach. At least for Nebraska, he was never going to be able to measure up to Tom, and that's really, that's the problem. So
Yeah, so for Frank Solich, as a segue into the Ohio Bobcats, their football history, um, just to give you some perspective, the Ohio Bobcats, they before Frank Solich came to Athens, Ohio, the Bobcats were, let's just be honest, they were terrible. From 1978 to 2004, they had a combined record of 95 and 197. They were pretty bad.
yeah,
And that's between 6 head coaches in that time span. So when Frank came along, when he was able to do his thing to bring his own people for his coaching staff with the Ohio Bobcats, things just went well. Things just clicked.
yeah.
And we actually got to see Frank Solich as a real head coach in that time frame from 2005 to 2020, which Frank Solich with the Ohio Bobcats, he went 115 and 82. So that right
Yeah.
there, talk about changing the culture of a football program right there. He was
I
exactly what Ohio needed. Yeah.
I had one of my best friends in college, one of my roommates for a few years, is a speech professor at the University of Ohio, and he told me years ago, before Frank came along, they would show up to watch the band at halftime, and then people would leave
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
if anybody showed up at all. So, I have some idea of how bad Ohio was before he got there. But yeah, you're right. I think that's a condition of being able to, be at the right place in the right time, in a place where you can fit and where you can do your own thing. The Nebraska has had to go through a lot of pain in the last 20 years. And I think a lot of that pain is because we spent 25 years under Osborne having a very good tradition, a very good culture, very good, a lot of winning. And then you just think that I try not to get myself in too much trouble because I usually do. Listen, you couldn't just here's the conundrum for, I think, Nebraska fans. Okay. You can't just take a human being and plug them into Nebraska's football program and say, replicate everything that Tom Osborne did. You know what I mean? You either he's a legendary coach or he's just a placeholder. and all the things that are built around it. Maybe I'm not explaining that correctly. But we have always had this attitude that, oh, well, you have to give out the black shirts and they have to be this way. And oh, the band has to do this when they come on the field. And oh, the guy who runs the Nebraska program has to be a Nebraska guy that understands us because we're so different than everybody else. Alabama went through this for many years after Paul Bear Bryant was, retired. And it took them they didn't just suddenly show up and go, well, Nick Saban was there waiting all this time. They had to go through the same pain of going, maybe we don't need an Alabama guy. Maybe we just need to find a guy who can actually organize a program, organize coaches, organize football, knows how to handle an offense, knows how to handle a defense, or turn those things over to other people. And I think it's been a long road for Nebraska fans, and here we are under Matt Rule, and we're going to see if it works again. You know,
Yeah,
there's,
personally, I think Matt Rule, he's a good coach. I think he has what it takes to build a program.
I think that wait, I had something, and then it went away because I'm
I'm
old.
sorry.
That's all right. There's the whole thing of you have to, in some way, I think that we had to make this journey. It's been a long, painful journey to learn the lesson that no, you don't just have to do things the way that you always did them. You still have right before I was doing this, and last night I shot a video about the wishbone offense, and a lot of that video contains why you can't run these offenses anymore, why you can't run the triple option with the same amount of effectiveness, and why you can't run the wishbone. Uh, Here's a spoiler: a lot of it has to do with the blocking changes over the last few decades, but uh, there's a lot of people that think, well, if we just went back to running the ball, if we just went back to running the triple option, no, it doesn't work that way. Football is about people, and it's about people having to be just like in any workforce, you have to have a right team of people that lead the people that are actually doing the work. And then the people have to doing the work all have to do it together. And they can't, you can't just make up for the slough guy and make excuses for him if you're a manager without ruining the dynamics of the rest of the team. And then you need the people that lead those that understand that whole process. That was a long, rambly bit too.
That's okay. So another question, since we're talking about formations, because I wanted to
Yeah.
get to this. And by the way, I recently watched your video about the split T formation. That was amazing how you described that with all the splitting, the inch gaps and all that. I love that. That was great.
No, good.
And
I wondered when I did that, am I getting too geeky about this? But
no, that's okay. That was great. But yeah, so about formations, because I wanted to ask you about this because I've heard about this throughout like Nebraska Cornhusker football history. Um, was there such a thing called the Osbone formation?
not that I'm
No?
familiar with. No.
Okay. Well,
I mean,
there
it
is.
might have been a joking, somebody might have made that as a joke, but no,
Okay.
not that I'm.
From what I remember, it was like an I formation, but with kind of like a wishbone kind of look to it. That's what I gather from it. That Tom
Well,
Osborne, yeah.
yeah, I don't, not that I know of.
Okay.
That there, the problem is the problem with a lot of football is you have. I think this occurs now more than ever, just because we're living in this era. But I think coaches have a tendency, and people who write about coaches have a tendency to take things that have been around for like decades and name them their own thing. IT companies do this a lot, where we take the same technology and we rename it so we can market it under our own banner.
Yeah.
But I know I don't think there would have I there might be. So
Yeah. So I also wanted to get your thoughts on where college football as a whole is headed with all this conference
oof.
realignments. And uh, you don't have to go into great depth about this, but just in your opinion, where do you think college football is headed with all these changes, with the House settlement and all these other
Oh
things going
boy.
on?
I my attitude about college football really right now is pretty poor. And I like the idea that the players are getting paid. I do. I they I can't imagine the level of work and dedication it takes to be a Division I football player. At 18 years old, I pretty much was dedicated to beer, you know. That's pretty much it. And I can't imagine how much dedication and discipline it takes to just get up to go to training like every 5 in the morning and lift weights and do this stuff all the time. So the amount of work they put in, I think, is, and they are making billions of dollars now for the universities all over the place. And I do think that they would deserve a cut of that. The transfer portal, I hate with a passion because here's a good example. Nebraska has like I think 138 or 136 people on the roster, and come fall that has to get cut to 105 because of the House settlement. If they prove that the roster limit, uh, that means there's to be a bunch of guys that'll be gone. Well, why should I get emotionally invested in players if they're only going to be around for a little while? That's my biggest problem with college sports or college football in particular. I don't think that I think the sport itself, I think the conference alignment has actually led to better football because you have big name teams. I mean, look at the Big Ten, four big name teams, or four at least established brands joined the conference. And that meant there were more games of high caliber. Where I think if you look across college football, most of what big like Power Four conference teams are playing in the non-conference, they're just playing cupcakes. And I think if we look at the future of this, I think that that's going to be more prevalent unless the College Football Playoff Committee emphasizes we need you playing. Like we need you, Notre Dame, we need you to play Michigan, or Nebraska. You know what? We need you to play Oklahoma out of conference, or Nebraska. We need to play. Well, I was going to say UCLA, but they're on a conference now. You know what I mean? Marquee. Well, Nebraska was going to play Tennessee, and that game got canceled because Matt Rule said, "I don't see any point in playing this when it could hurt us more than help us, and our goal is to get the college football playoff." He is not wrong in that regard, but it's really disappointing to not be able to play Tennessee. I think that would be a game that would be fun. I would love to go to Tennessee for a 1-and-1 and have people yell at me and from Tennessee. That would be fun, but we're not going to get that, and I think that's dangerous. And the other part that really I don't have a good feeling about is college sports in general, because college sports, its purpose was to provide an opportunity to people to get a higher education if they couldn't do it academically, and all of the forces in the world have conspired to crush that idea. And I think that the House settlement and obviously the lawsuits that come after that, unless Congress steps in to give somebody antitrust exemptions, uh, do some kind of thing where they aren't going to be ruled as employees, then I think that road is where they're going to eventually go, and I think that will be very bad for all of college sports. And Nebraskans by and large. We love all our teams. We love our softball teams. We love our baseball team, our volleyball team for certain. Wrestling just finished at number 2. There's a big wrestling, group of Nebraska fans. Uh, I don't know if that's true for a lot of other schools. They tend to have primary sports and things like that. The SEC, they're a good baseball conference. They love their baseball teams, things like that. Well, what's going to happen down the road if all the money goes into football and all of a sudden you eventually in 3 to 5 years, everybody's ruled as employees? Well, to this day, with all this talk about this, I have never seen anyone do a cost analysis of that. And I'm guessing that if they sat down and did a cost analysis, it would be this can't work at all, ever, for any reason, unless we don't play, unless you pay players like $25,000 a year, you know, but you can't. That's the part I haven't fully gone down that road in my brain because I don't like where it goes in the first place. So the History Channel gives me a. Here's the thing: the History Channel gives me the ability to live in a past that I love. And I can spend a lot of time there, and I can spend a lot of time being amazed at the never-ending supply of stories. The Carlisle Indians is probably one of the most amazing stories in college football history, and I don't know how many people know that. I will say this. Recently, I went to a married couples thing with my wife at my church. Now, obviously, I didn't marry a 24-year-old. Well, she was when I married her, 30 some 40 years ago or whatever it is. Uh, we're older than most of the couples, obviously, in our church, right? So, for some reason, because I'm a blurty, mouthy guy, I brought up Woody Hayes to some guy, and he said, I don't know who that is. And I went, what? What? How can you not know who Woody Hayes is? And he goes, is he a musician? I'm like, how have we fit? And then I went around and I asked a bunch of the other young men there, and not a single one of them knew who Woody Hayes was. And I thought, I wept for this. I wept. I went, oh my God, we have failed our youth. We used to be a proper country. People don't know who Woody Hayes is. What has things come to? And so I have to do a Woody Hayes thing, coming up because I mean, Woody Hayes again was another, if you look at his record, I think you look at, one of the greatest coaches in history, but he was also a fairly complex person. He had so many scandals where he was just, punching people and doing things that were inappropriate for his position, but at the same time, a very extremely dedicated, hardworking, loyal, and it's the dichotomy. And when we look at those type of people and we can say, how can we reconcile the scandalous part of him with the part that molded so many young people to become better people themselves down the road? That's a lot of blabbing too, isn't it?
Yeah. We only have 5 minutes remaining here, so we're gonna start wrapping this up.
Okay.
One last good question I could ask is since of course you make YouTube videos, uh, for anyone out there that is wanting to start their own YouTube channel and make their own YouTube videos, what advice, generally speaking, what advice would you have for them?
Well, I'd say do it. I think that we're living in a time in which the I talked about all the newspapers and the bias that's gone on for years. We're living in a time in which the mass media has really discredited themselves. And people are, when you go on YouTube, there are so many unbelievably fantastic channels doing almost everything that you can find. Now, a big problem with that is they have the same biases if you're in the political spectrum that they do with Fox News and CNN and all that kind of stuff. But I would say I think it's interesting. For me, it connects me with a lot of people, and I don't get out much. I live with a brain injury, and it really makes it difficult for me to go a lot of places and be as active in the outdoors as I used to be. But YouTube can connect you with a lot of people. In terms of advice, I'd say uh, there's some, oh, I'm trying to, there's some vidIQ guys channel. They do a lot of stuff on, how can you be successful on YouTube. Nate, Nate Black. I watch this guy all the time. He's a young man and he talks about it. There are many channels on YouTube that tell you how to be really good at YouTube. It's not a cut thing. It's a grind thing. It takes a long time for you to get anywhere and to get any traction and to get noticed. But I think that it's fun and it's a way for you, again, to connect with people. Find a niche and don't worry about I've written, right? I've written for 20 years. I wrote 20 years in the computer industry, and now I've written 20 years in the sports industry. I wrote a couple books, one about me dying and recovering from my own death. And but now I forgot completely where I was going. But being a writer, you're used to telling stories. And my biggest problem that I have always had in writing is that I wanted everything to be perfect. And perfection, especially when it comes to YouTube, perfection is the enemy of good. And you just need to start someplace. Like if you go back and watch it, the look at the first history videos I did, I think they're pretty cringy. You know, they're pretty, I don't know what I was wearing.
Yeah.
I didn't even think about it. And, obviously I do all my own editing and I try to get better all the time. And the early ones are really not very well edited, but I started and then that encouraged me to keep going and doing the rest of this stuff. And then, like I said, I would really like to get to the point where I can hire people to do some pretty specific things that are quite frankly going to cost a fair amount of money. So, I have plans for it. You got to start and just figure out what you want to do with it.
Yeah, I definitely agree that, and this is what we do. We have fun when we make these
Yeah,
videos, just like this interview right here. And that will be a good way to end it. Thank you so much, Jon Johnston, for your
sure.
time, just chatting with me about college football and history. It's been amazing. Thank you so much, John. And I will
Yep.
make sure to link your YouTube channel so that everyone can go check them out. Thank you
Okay.
so much, John.
Take care.